A reading from the Hebrew Scriptures from the book of Ruth. One day Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, it's my duty to ensure your security and fulfillment and make sure you are provided for. And Boaz, whose workers you have been following, is our closest relative. Tonight he will be winnowing grain on the threshing floor. Wash up and put on perfume and dress in your finest clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he goes to sleep, watch to see where he lies down, then go and uncover his feet and lie down with him. He'll tell you what to do next." Ruth replied, "I will do as you tell me." So Ruth and Boaz were married, and from their union, God enabled Ruth to conceive, and she gave birth to a child. Then the women of the village said to Naomi, "Praised be God, who has not abandoned you, but provided you with yet another redeemer. May the child's name be remembered through all of Israel, and give you renewed life, and support you when you are old. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and has proven better than 7 children of your own could ever have been, has given birth to him." Naomi took the child into her lap, and she became his caretaker. And Naomi's neighbors named the child, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi. We will call him Obed." And Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. For the witness of an ancient faith, thanks be to God.
A reading from the Gospel of Mark. In his teaching, Jesus said, "Beware of the religious scholars who like to walk about in long robes, be greeted obsequiously in the market squares, and take the front seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at banquets. These are the ones who swallow the property of widows and offer lengthy prayers for the sake of appearance. They will be judged all the more severely." Jesus sat down opposite the collection box and watched the people putting money in it, and many of the rich put in a great deal. A poor widow came and put in 2 small coins, the equivalent of a penny. Then Jesus called out to the disciples and said to them, "The truth is, this woman has put in more than all who have contributed to the treasury. For they have put in money from their surplus, but she has put in everything she possessed from the little she had, all she had to live on." For the love of God in Christ Jesus, thanks be to God.
Put not your trust in princes, the psalmist encourages us. Do not trust political systems or religious ones. Put your faith in God, for where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. In one of his notable writings, Oscar Wilde wrote that in his view, the most tragic fact in the whole of the French Revolution is not that Marie Antoinette was killed for being a queen, but that the starved peasant of the Vendée voluntarily went out to die for the hideous cause of feudalism. Hearing our gospel story this morning, we might be tempted to say something similar, that the most tragic fact in the corruption of the world of Jesus was not the hideous colonial violence of the Romans and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but that the poor widow gave all she had to a failing leadership and its flailing institutions. Furthermore, we might ask, what similar tragedies might we see and be part of ourselves in our own world? Yes, Like Oscar Wilde, I am being provocative. But I think it is vital to understand today's gospel in its context, not least its political circumstances in which Judean religion was intimately entwined. Not to do so is not only to misunderstand this passage, but to risk a simplistic moralizing. It's also to miss the point of Mark's gospel as a whole, of which this story is intimately linked. Because Mark's good news is revolutionary in character. It is a call to spiritual arms and to radical transformation, not simply reformism. It is written in the aftermath of the Judean revolt in the 60s and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. So it is no coincidence that in this gospel text and in the verses afterwards, Jesus goes on to speak immediately and prophetically about the destruction of the temple, about the destruction of the political assumptions, social assumptions of the world in which he lived, and the end times violence that surrounds it. Because in a sense we might say that today's gospel reading is a last straw in the end of an old order. So let me trace three key features to which today's gospel reading points us. Namely, the falling of political systems and empires, the ambiguities of fidelity, and the kind of faith in the future to which we are always called. Firstly, as I've said, we cannot understand this story except in the context of the falling of the old Judean religious system and the political and social assumptions of their day. Because there is a deep crisis about authority and about how you get to justice that is happening in the time of Jesus. And that's why it's an important story, because that is a constant thing that comes back to us, especially at particular times in history. So what kind of a system, a kingdom or a reign, should prevail? Because the old order has failed so many people. To whom should it belong? How should it be formed? Mark's gospel begins dramatically with John the Baptist as one of the contemporary firebrands, preaching the authority of God, demanding a different kind of justice to the ways in which politicians and others have tried to establish a reign that will give peace for people in the past. And John is portrayed as the forerunner of Jesus, whom Mark portrays throughout the gospel in constant conflict with other authorities and the status quo. And now Jesus is in Jerusalem, the heart of national and religious authority, coming to the denouement of his story. So today's gospel, therefore, vividly presents this failure of the falling Judean world, represented in both its leaders, its elites, and its people. On the one hand, Jesus is drawing attention to the elites, to the teachers of the law, who've been represented as obsessed with their own self-importance and their own ideas, and using their authority in ways which, if haven't exploited others, have done little to help them out of their poverty and their struggles. On the other hand, Jesus points to one of the poor and the vulnerable, a widow whose limited resources are handed over to the authorities once more, profoundly reducing her ability to find true agency and hope. So where is there hope in this story? I'm reminded of one of W.B. Yeats' great poems, The Second Coming, written just over 100 years ago, just after World War I, and with the Easter Rising and civil war in Ireland, at a time of deep crisis over political and moral authority, and with incipient fascism rising in the world. Reflecting on such vexed times, the poet wrote these wrenching words: "Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned." I think that's akin to what Mark is saying to the insight of Jesus on the edge of the disaster of his own world. And Yates' following words are similar to Jesus' comments on those who should know better, like the elites, the teachers of the law, and the people as represented by the poor widow. Yates says, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. For it will indeed be, in the story, the worst in their passionate intensity who prevail in the coming years, in the coming destruction of Jerusalem, a continuing symbol of the destructive violence of humanity whenever it loses its moral and spiritual compass." And I think we see the consequences around us in our world today. And today's gospel reading, therefore, challenges us about our own roles and responses in this. Because secondly, our gospel story today provokes us to ask, what is true fidelity, true faithfulness, not least in the person and actions of the poor widow? Is her giving all that she had a sign of true faith and a pointer to us too? It is easy, isn't it, to seize on her as a good example, which is how she has typically been interpreted in Christian tradition. After all, Jesus himself, in this passage, directly contrasts her sacrificial offering with the showy giving of the rich, as well as the religious showy concerns of the teachers of the law. If we've heard the earlier stories of Mark's gospel about giving or resisting giving all we have, we can also understandably make this connection, because the poor widow's total commitment stands in stark contrast to the rich man, for example, who came to Jesus but turned away sadly when he was asked to give away all he had to the poor. But in reality, however, speaking spiritually and morally, are not the poor widow's actions somewhat more ambiguous? Because does her giving all she had, for instance, really represent holy living, or a self-harming collusion with oppressive systems and teachings? Because if we are rightly to trace connections and contrasts in today's passage and in the gospel as a whole, we need to avoid simple moralism and dualistic distinctions between the rich and poor in this country, as if there are forces of light and forces of darkness and we just choose one side. Whether as if there are just distinctions between powerful men like the elites, the teachers of the law, and more powerless people like the widow. Because if we can legitimately draw out a moral judgment by Jesus here, it is indeed principally a judgment on the rich and the powerful, not least the elites, the teachers of the law, the supposed guardians of moral and spiritual authority. But this does not imply simply a comparable moral exaltation of the poor as such, in this case the widow. Because a crucial line in Jesus' critique of the rich and the powerful is surely in verse 48, where he says of the leaders that they devour widows' houses. They devour widows' houses. And how do they do that, we may ask? Well, by encouraging the poor, the widows, to give all they have to the current system without any transformation. In other words, whilst recognizing the wholeheartedness of the poor widow's sacrificial offering, Jesus is not exactly commending it as appropriate. Rather, he is pointing to it as a visible enactment of the way that the system, the teachers of the law and everyone else who gets benefit out of the system, have exploited the person and people of the poor. So how far, we might also ask, is the poor widow propping up, and if you like, voting for, a corrupt and patriarchal system? What is the Mark and Jesus really commending in this story? Are they attacking institutional religious life and its leaders as a whole, and urging us just to sweep away those formulations in our lives and world? Are they simply valorizing the poor widow and instructing us to be simply, wholeheartedly faithful to whatever leadership is thrown up? Or are they partially encouraging us, yes, to religious critique and to valuing the poor and generosity, but only in the service of a much larger vision and deeper call? Because thirdly, if we're to understand today's gospel passage properly in its context, then we have to see it as much more than simply a critique of institutional religion or the system of the day and an affirmation of the women and the poor. We have to view it as a call to a different kind of faith in the future. Let us hope and pray that we ourselves, and there are no guarantees, that we ourselves do not live through the kind of devastations highlighted by W.B. Yeats, where things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, and mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Plenty of people do, however, as we see in the past, and as we see from Ukraine to Palestine, in Sudan and elsewhere. And meanwhile, of course, on this continent, First Nations people continue to suffer the consequences of colonialism, and the rich give little attention, and the middle classes, little attention to those who are truly suffering, the poor and the homeless, and those who cannot afford to live in our society today. And that's a wake-up call, if we have not heard one this week. The empires of both church and liberal democracy on which the Western world has rested are under considerable strain, as we have seen. In the case of the church, I think we can certainly expect that many more temples will go. And it may be that many of our Western liberal and democratic shibboleths will also fail or flail in the days to come. But neither blaming the clerics, the elites alone, nor simplistic fidelity are effective solutions. Rather, as the Gospel of Mark proclaims, the real required responses lie beyond and much deeper. They flow from the grace of God, embodied in more sacrificial commitment on the part of the rich and the powerful, and more active cooperative self-help on the part of the poor and exploited. And maybe the story of these two other poor widows we hear about today, Ruth and Naomi, might offer us a little clue to how to negotiate the in-between and ending times when systems flail and justice and embodied love are hard to find. Because last week we heard a lot about love's idealism, didn't we? At the beginning of the book of Ruth, when the two women express their commitment to one another. But then they have to come down to earth and live in the realities of a patriarchal and often brutal world. And just because we're moderns doesn't mean patriarchy or brutality go away. They just take different forms. So in today's reading, the women have a challenge. And what they do is to combine to help themselves and to help others around them, using what powers and creativity they have. And it's somewhat unorthodox, because they have to think and not just do the same old thing and use the system as if the system isn't changing around them. And so they use, for example, the power of seduction. There's two bits of that story we heard, and we miss out a little bit in the middle, because what happens when Ruth gets to the feet of Boaz? And they're words that, what's the word for it? You know, when you say a word and you're not quite, it's a polite way of saying that she seduces, and she's encouraged to do by Naomi, because she uses what power she has. And In a very Puritan world, that is not quite morally right. But it's shrewd and it's right to do because we have to think of other ways forward than just the same old ways of the past. And that's what they do. They don't just sacrifice themselves to the system like the other poor widow. But with Boaz, they cooperate not only to survive, but within the limitations of their time to thrive. So in doing so, while they still live in imperfect circumstances, they nurture, crucially, a child. They build for the future. They offer a promise because they respond to the promise of God that is never crushed by whatever happens around us. A child of hope, Obed, which means a servant of God, a living symbol of God's enduring promise. Now, such creative participation in God's enduring grace does not change the whole world. It does not prevent systems falling, but it does keep hope and divine embodiment alive. Let me conclude. The best, wrote W.B. Yeats tellingly, lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The call of Jesus, as Mark's gospel expresses it, is neither to resignation or despair, nor to collusion, as we see respectively on the part of the religious leaders and the poor widow in our gospel story today. So if we, like the people of Jesus' day, are to resist the powers of destruction beyond us and within us, and to live fruitfully through the failing of empires, goodish or ill, then we need both to be renewed in both sacrificial compassion, suffering with others, and in the strength of acting up like Ruth and Naomi, despite oppression. There are many who are full of passionate intensity in our world today, politically and religiously, and we can easily be disheartened or choose the paths of false teachers of the law and the limitations of poor widows. But in the enduring strength of the cross and the joyful power of the resurrection, there are other options, and in and through God's grace, all things can be born and transformed. In the name of Jesus, descendant of the poor migrant widow Ruth, the one true teacher of the law, and the body of the oppressed. Amen.